Hi, and welcome to Open, the show that opens the Bronx and the rest of the world to you. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today we'll update you on what's happening in and around our borough. Coming up, the FBI has recently issued a warning against using public phone charging stations. The security and privacy expert for Consumer Reports shares more details later on. Then, after learning about how period poverty affects those who menstruate, a young woman started her own national organization to tackle this issue. The operation director at For Women by Women Period joins me later to discuss their fight. Why is there a lack of access to menstrual products? After that, over the last year, there have been several cases of extreme weather throughout the country. The Vice President of Communications for Climate Central joins us later to give us more insight. How is the change in weather a result of climate change? And finally, the FDA recently approved an over-the-counter version of the opioid overdose reversal drug, naloxone. Joining me to discuss the benefits of this is the director of the Opioid Overdose Prevention Program at the NYU School of Global Public Health and two outreach specialists. How will easy access to this treatment save lives? So stay tuned. All this and much more is headed your way because we're now officially open. Hello, everyone. I'm Kibin Alleyne, and today is Tuesday, April 25th. You are now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. The FBI is warning Americans to avoid using free charging stations located in public areas like airports and shopping centers. Using these stations could leave consumers and their smartphones vulnerable to an act many are calling juice jacking. Joining me now to discuss these charging stations how these charging stations are being used to spread malware is security privacy expert for Consumer Reports, Amira Dhalla. Amira, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I want to jump right into it. This is the first time that I'm hearing this term. Can you explain what juice jacking is?
Yeah, so juice jacking is commonly referred to the hacking into phones to steal data or infect them with malware. It can be done in a public setting where portable chargers are set and often made to look like real chargers. And what they do is they prey upon people who want to charge their phone, but often are in fact giving their data or their phone access to cyber criminals who are then infecting them or stealing their data from them.
Now, I'm curious to know, how are scammers using public charging stations to conduct this act? So, is it the actual entire port? Is it just the USB? Can you just explain, what that act is?
Yeah, this actually started in a demonstration at a conference a very long time ago where hackers demonstrated that this was possible. And what they did is they set up a USB port that was made to look synonymous with any other port that you would find in a public setting. And they set it up there, seeing if anyone would plug into it and use it. And so hackers are really leveraging that same type of mentality where they're in public settings where you're commonly seeing USB ports where you can plug in your phone and setting them up very, very similarly to that style. So people don't often think twice. They think that they're public and open and available like any other USB ports that they see in public.
Now, according to CNN, this issue dates back to 2011, which I was very shocked to hear because it's been a very long time. How has, this act evolved now that technology is more advanced?
Yeah, it's really important to mention that date because it has been around for a while. And although we are seeing news reports about it now, it's really important to mention that the actual act of juice jacking has not increased significantly in that time. It is quite intensive to set up and place in a way that can be done privately and securely for a hacker. So the reports that we're hearing right now are FBI tweets, specifically out of Denver, where they've suggested that it is possible, so we should be more secure. These tweets and the reports are not coming from a rise or widespread attacks that have been happening in this. So I really do want to just make sure that we note that there isn't an increase in the usage of juice jacking, but there is an increase in awareness that this is a possibility. And so over time, what we've seen in the past 10 plus years is that people have just become more reliant on their phones. So what hackers and cyber criminals are taking advantage of is that reliance on our phone, that as soon as it's dying, we head somewhere public where we can quickly charge it. Whether we are traveling more these days or relying on our phone for GPS or communication, we really need it charged so that we can continue on in our daily lives. So hackers are really taking advantage of this moment in time where we are vulnerable to potentially using something like a public charging station.
Now, I kind of want to add on to that. I remember seeing a story a while back that it was also kind of dangerous to buy like third-party chargers, especially like on Amazon or like, maybe at like random stores. Would you say that's kind of similar to what's happening right now?
Yeah, the most secure plugins you can get are directly from the device manufacturer. So Apple or Android, really make sure that their added security are in the USB plug specifically. So those are the best direct forms of charging that you can use, and I still recommend them to this day. But there are other options, and we know that people often in a clinch use other ones, and they can be more expensive. So we know that only certain people often have access to more than one, or ones that they use for travel or otherwise.
Now, are these places that, host the public charging stations, are they aware of what's possibly happening when people are using their device?
So places, it's been common that this often can happen in very public settings. So recently, the recommendations have said, watch out for airports, watch out for malls, coffee shops. These are the type of places where we are more commonly using our phones to plug in, to charge, because these are places we stop and can stay for a while. And so as much as I think these places are aware that this is happening and this can happen, because we don't have that widespread usage where people are being juice jacked, these places are not being held accountable, and they're not actually doing any preventative measures in these areas. As I said, it is harder for juice jacking to occur here because these are often more publicly surveilled areas. So if someone is setting up an infrastructure as big as a USB station, that is more often going to be caught on something like camera, and they can be traced back to the individuals. So it's less likely, and there's no actual actions taken by these spaces and public areas that are actually hosting what could be juice jacking.
Now, you mentioned that although it's like an act that is obviously, very bad, it isn't happening, although we're more aware about it, it's not happening as often. Would you say that makes it a little bit harder for people like yourself who are trying to study or follow this and see what's happening?
Yeah, it can make it much harder. And also, if it occurs, it's also hard to understand where it occurred at. And so that's one of the misconceptions that we're really trying to understand is if your phone gets infected by malware at the point in which you might not realize it was the public airport or coffee shop that you plugged into. At that point, you might not know where it is. So we're not able to necessarily trace it back at this exact moment. But there are other forms of malicious attacks that happen every day, more commonplace. And I think about phishing emails, I think about other areas. So if we're looking at in a cybersecurity threat landscape of where people are most vulnerable, oftentimes I will look at other places where we are able to trace it back, where we do have a lot more infections happening every single day in many types of ways. And we really focus our concern and our actual attention there.
Now, I'm curious to know, let's say you are a victim of this juice jacking. What type of information could be taken from your phone with this malware?
So anything can be taken from your phone is the short answer. If someone is taking your data, they're probably looking for private, personalized information. That can be as easy as getting on your email. They can use your GPS, your social media accounts. They can actually get into any sort of account and app that you have on your mobile device. If they're using malware, they might actually be doing things like taking advantage of your phone to make a double copy of all the data on your account. They might be doing things like putting spyware on your phone. In some cases, they might even be putting ransomware on your phone and locking your phone down, in which case they might be asking for a fee to unlock your phone so that you have access to get back in.
Wow, that sounds very scary. And I've heard so many stories online of people saying they're getting calls that it looks like it's from them, it's from other people. Is that a result of juice jacking, or is that just another, form of, I guess, your phone kind of being hacked?
There is a very common scam right now where you're getting calls that are focused from numbers you might know from relatives, from family members, or just even ones in your area code that look like they might be something that you might want to pick up. That is an entirely different scam, although I will say when it comes to juice jacking and malware, there are signs that your phone could be infected, and having calls or numbers or emails that go out from your phone that you're not doing could be a use case of juice jacking.
Now, I want to talk about, as you mentioned, we use our phones for everything. We heavily rely on our phones. So that means that we have Apple Pay, Google Pay, saved passwords, everything on our phone. Because this is happening, do you think people should maybe refrain from, relying on our phone for, sensitive things like our bank accounts and stuff like that?
Apple and Google have been doing a lot of work to really combat things like juice jacking. And so they've been adding extra security functions where you can do security checkups and more. So I actually think they're trying to take more preventative measures to actually make sure your phone is more secure from all the things that can be added onto it. I know that your phone is often your bank account, it's your credit card, it's your pass into the train.
Right.
It can be many things. And so or even your shopping card, whatever it could be. My advice would actually be not to stop using these features, but instead use them safely. Make sure that these accounts are backed up on other devices and you have access to them elsewhere. They're using multi-factor authentication. We actually recommend that passkey is the best form of defense in this case. Using safe and good passwords, often password managers are really good. And making sure that you're aware if anyone else has information or access to these accounts is really helpful.
That now that you mentioned that, I'm thinking like, oh yeah, like on the Notes app, you have like every single password you ever own, so it's like everything is on our cell phone. Now, because of this, if you are a victim of this, I could only imagine. I know that like when I feel like my email has been compromised, I'm like so scared and I'm like, what do I do? What should you do if you realize, or if you feel like, my phone has been compromised? What should someone do in that event?
Well, to start, there's like some signs that you might not be aware you have malware that you should be consider. So security vulnerabilities can happen with and without juice jacking. And you should know that if your phone is doing funny things, so slow down, crashes, overheating, if it has pop-ups or ads or drained battery, or if it's sending emails to people without you actually doing it, these are all signs that you might have malware on your phone. And it can also happen by downloading malicious downloads or clicking on malicious links. And so there are many signs that can come from juice jacking or without juice jacking. So scanning your phone and at least keeping attention to what is happening is like the first step. But if you have been impacted, there are many other steps you can take. I would say the first one is to not make any purchases online or using any of the accounts to start. Make sure your device has the latest software updates. In some cases, you might actually want to restart your device to factory settings. You might want to delete some apps or histories or texts. And on a separate device, you might probably want to change your passwords and account measures for these accounts. As well as on iPhone and Android devices, there are different actions you can take. On Android, you can do a scan of it in the background in the security settings. And on iPhone, you can do a similar security checkup, But there's also apps that you can do that can support you, such as iVerify, that can do scanning for you in the background. So if you do think you have malware, or if you do have it on your phone, there are all these things you can do to get rid of it, to make sure that you are stopping it in its trail and protecting your accounts and your device as a whole and your data. But the last thing I'll probably say is that if you do reporting it to the FTC, they have a great site at reportfraud.ftc.gov that you can use to report it, because this is helpful for them to monitor where scams and malicious attacks are happening, so that we can alert the public and make sure that people are getting the right advice that they need in the instances this might occur to them.
All right. Well, Amira, thank you so much for joining us and having this discussion.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
To stay up to date with all the work Consumer Reports does, please go to their website at www.consumerreports.org, or you can follow them on social media at Consumer Reports. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Open right after this.
Kids!
I don't want to talk about it.
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 Families don't have to talk about everything, but they should talk about how to plan for an emergency.
Kids, you all right?
This family's prepared. Get tips and resources to make your family's emergency plan. Go to nyc.gov/readyny or call 311 for more information.
You can now watch MNN, Brick TV, QPTV, and SIC TV on BronxNet. Tune in to BX Omni, Channel 67 Optimum, 2133 Fios during most Sunday evenings. We'll show you some amazing content from our friends at Manhattan Neighborhood Network, Brick TV in Brooklyn, Queens Public Television, and Staten Island Community Television. Every borough represented in the Boogie Down. Epic partnerships for the ages. And catch our new Next channel, produced in partnership with MNN, 24/7 on BronxNet Channel 952 Optimum and 2138 Fios.
Welcome back. Across the world, women and girls are experiencing period poverty. This is described as the lack of access to menstrual products and education. In an effort to address this issue, Organization for Women by Women Period assists menstruating individuals in need with care packages, education, and more. Joining me to discuss their efforts is Organization Director Trinidad Duran. Trinidad, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, can you just tell me about the Organization for Women by Women Period?
Yeah, we're a nonprofit that got started about 2 years ago during the pandemic. And basically the way we got started was our founder, Carrington Baker, was at a food distribution pantry in Flushing, Queens. Her and some of our other original members were volunteering their time when they realized that one of the products that wasn't being offered included menstrual products. If they were offered, they were in very limited amounts, which often meant that by the time some people who needed them came around, they would be out of the product. So she came up with this idea of having an entire organization dedicated to providing these types of products to unhoused people and low-income people within our communities. And that's how we got started. So far, we've been able to raise over $8,000 to support our operating funds, and we've been able to distribute over 100,000 products thanks to the help of Quora, who was one of our main donors.
Now, period poverty is rarely discussed in conversations about public health. Why do you think as a society we are still struggling to have these conversations?
Well, unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma that is associated with menstruation and a woman or a menstruating person's menstrual cycle. And there is still a lot of taboos surrounding the topic. I personally remember the first time having a conversation about period was in my elementary school in 5th grade, and they separated boys and girls. So that creates this negative stereotype or this negative narrative that makes boys and allows men to say, well, that's a woman's issue, or let the women solve that. And so people aren't coming together to talk about this issue, and it's being brushed aside as a woman's, that's a lady thing.
And, I like that you mentioned that when, your organization was doing outreach that, a lot of people weren't donating menstrual products. And I think that even some women with the, best intentions who know this is something that we need, sometimes it just often slips your mind and think like, oh, yeah, other, women need this. Now, I kind of leads me to my next question. What does it mean to experience period poverty, and how prevalent is it in our country?
Period poverty is really prevalent in our country. It's estimated that about 1 out of every 4 women or menstruator experiences some sort of period poverty. And when it goes hand in hand with the U.S. poverty rate. So when you have someone who is already having a difficult time securing food, securing water, securing diapers for their children, they're also going to be faced with the choice of, can I afford to buy pads and tampons this month, or does my child's food come before that, or do I need to feed an elderly, or another economic issue, or decision needs to be made. And when push comes to shove, unfortunately, a lot of times menstruators are going to choose to provide food or pay the rent over securing period poverty products, which then leads to them using less sanitary methods such as like toilet paper and other methods.
Now, is there I know there's something called the pink tax. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And is it, does it play a part in period poverty?
Yeah, the pink tax plays a very important part in period poverty. Fortunately enough, New York doesn't have the period tax. I believe we got rid of it officially in 2020, but other states such as Colorado, Alabama, and Hawaii continue to have a tax on period products, which means that they get taxed just for being something that is offered to a woman. Pads and tampons are already very expensive in and of itself, so to add an additional tax and taxing them sort of kind of as a luxury good makes it even less accessible to menstruators within the community.
Can you talk about what your organization is doing to raise awareness about this?
Yeah. So, I would. So our organization, in order to talk about period poverty and the access to menstrual products, we like to. So we have two main ways in which we talk about period poverty. Our social media is pretty much based on educating our communities about period poverty and the ways in which we can go about breaking the stigma that is surrounding periods and menstruation and other reproductive issues, and just eliminating that taboo and making people feel okay to talk about this stuff, because until we feel secure and comfortable speaking about these issues, we're not going to be able to bring about change. And so that's one way in which we go about providing education. But we also work with a couple of high schools, and we have youth groups within them. So educating the younger generation about these issues is also very important, and a very important step within our movement.
Now, you mentioned the youth group, and I understand that you have a youth program. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's so important, especially, for younger people to kind of be familiar with this, and as you mentioned, kind of step away from that stigma of revolving around periods?
Yeah, so the younger generation is very interested in helping bring about social change, whether that's, period and the period movement, or food economic, global climate, as we've seen currently within the news. That's something that a lot of the younger generation is very interested in helping. So we have taken steps to actively include them in what we do by creating youth programs within different high schools and within different communities. So far, we've successfully been able to test pilot this program in our high school in Rochester, and so they will put on their own drives, product drives, have people within their own communities bring products, which then they can distribute back out to those in need within their communities. So it's goes based off of the whole mutual aid ideology and concepts. So we make them feel as if they have the agency to do something about this issue within their own community.
Now, I understand your organization also has something called moon packs. Can you explain what they are and how they are given out?
Yeah, so the moon packs were something that we designed particularly to deal with the issue within the unhoused communities. New York has a lot of unhoused people living, whether in temporary housing or on the streets, and that presents a real issue when it comes to menstruating. If they don't even have a continuous, safe, secure access to water, that could lead to many different issues during menstruation. A lot of menstruators, use tampons or menstrual cups, and if they're unable to sanitize their hands before and after inserting the tampon or the menstrual cup, that could lead to different health issues within their reproductive system. So the moon packs were designed to be able to be a catch-all solution to many of the issues that arise for unhoused people experiencing period poverty. They include a week's worth of period products, whether tampons or pads or both, 2 pairs of underwears, a disposable heating pad to help alleviate some of the pain in the menstrual cramps, and then also flushable wipes in which they can use to clean themselves and clean their hands before and after inserting tampons.
Now, I really appreciate the fact that it's also focusing on just hygiene, as in having clean hands. That's something that a lot of people don't really think about when you're privileged, that you can easily just go to a sink and wash your hands. So I really appreciate, you talking about that. I also want to bring up the fact that, of course, while you're supporting women and girls, the organization also makes an effort to acknowledge those from different genders. Can you just explain why that was so important?
Yeah, it was very important for us to make sure that other menstruators felt included within our work and what we do, because we recognize that when we neglect to accept the experiences that trans, non-binary, gender fluid people experience, it creates a very unsafe and hostile environment for them. And that's the last thing that we want to do. We want to make sure that everyone feels they have a space within our community, and make sure that everyone knows that we are here to help regardless of your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your whatever it may be. Our main ideology is just to help those who need help.
Now, what can policymakers or health experts do to eliminate this type of poverty?
So there's quite a few things that can be done. I do know that there is a legislative bill pending in the works to hopefully get on the floor, and it's Assembly Bill A7777A. And basically what this bill would do would be to allow public assistance, such as SNAP benefits, to cover menstrual products. And I believe this bill in particular would allow up to $10 a month to go towards period products, which is something that we currently do not allow. If we're able to have public assistance and public benefits cover menstrual products for those in low-income communities and unhoused people, that would be a complete game changer and would make period products more accessible to the general public.
Well, Trinidad, thank you so much for joining us to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
If you would like to learn more about their organization or help join the fight against period poverty, please go to the FWBWP website at www.forwomenbywomenperiod.org or follow them on social media at forwomenbywomenperiod. We have to take a quick break, but we'll be back with more Open right after this.
Even though we didn't grow up together, he's my favorite brother.
Hey, sis.
I'm the baby of the family, and he's the gentle giant.
What you know about Port Georgian?
Man, please, that's a classic.
You know when they say people are a rare breed? Yeah, he's that.
sorry. I'll be back in a few hours.
Don't worry, Shug. You know I'm for you.
I know.
Go get the football.
That was my favorite memory. He was always for you. This is a true story of me, Bridget Floyd, and this guy, George Perry Floyd Jr., my big brother.
Welcome back. Extreme changes in weather and natural disasters like fires and floods are increasingly becoming more prevalent, which may be a result of climate change. Concerns surrounding climate change and severe weather remain a long-time concern for many environmental activists and researchers. Joining me to discuss these concerns is Vice President of Communications for Climate Central, Peter Girard. Peter, thank you so much for joining me.
Kibin, thank you for having me.
Now, can you first just talk about your organization, Climate Central?
Climate Central is an organization of researchers studying climate change and helping people communicate climate science.
Now, can you talk about the difference between weather versus climate? I feel like I've learned about it so many times, but it can be so confusing and a little overwhelming. So can you just talk about the difference between weather and climate?
One of my favorite explanations is that climate is our planet's personality and weather is its moods. Excuse me. So weather changes. It's erratic. It can be different from moment to moment. And studying weather, particularly statistically, can be really noisy. On the other hand, when you look at climate, which is this sort of broader lens, and you take a look at larger spans, trends over decades, a lot of that noise disappears and you can see clearer trends. And that's what we're seeing with climate change.
So I just to reiterate, like climate would be, let's say, it's always supposed to be cold during the winter time, right? That's the climate. But if it's like 70 degrees, that's just considered the weather.
Weather is always going to be erratic. There are always going to be weird exceptions in weather. Climate broadly is that background, those systems that shape weather. But again, weather inconsistent, climate generally more so.
Now, how is a change in weather a result of climate change?
The biggest change, of course, is that our planet is warming. And so we're experiencing these longer, hotter summers and shorter winters. There are a couple of other areas where we're seeing these effects directly that people may not know quite as well. One is precipitation. So a warmer atmosphere holds more water. Our atmosphere has warmed something like 2 degrees over the last century, most of that coming in the last few decades. That means that it can hold something in the neighborhood of 7% more water. That's available to come down as rain and snow. And when we're seeing events like the atmospheric rivers in California, like this rain that we're seeing on the east coast of Florida earlier this week, snow earlier this winter, the rains that we're seeing in the southeast, all of these are directly connected to climate change and that capacity to hold more moisture and release more of it as rain.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because whenever discussing climate change, we often do think just hot and cold. We don't think about water or fires. So can you just expand on that a little bit more? I know you kind of briefly talked about flooding, but also, how is these like massive fires a result of climate change?
The East and the West Coast, and we're talking about the U.S., East and the West Coast have really different weather patterns. And particularly in the West, you're seeing an increase in what you think of as fire weather. The first cause for that is heat. It's simply hotter and drier. And so that means that the forest floors, the areas where you've got fuels accumulating are less moist. It's much easier for fires to sort of start and move through. You're also seeing windier conditions. And so those three in combination, higher temperatures, lower humidity, higher wind, are creating far more dangerous fire conditions. In the East, we don't see that in the same way or in the same patterns as we do in the summer, but we absolutely see some of those same trends in spring and fall. And we're seeing wildfires in the East just in the last week or so, driven by some of those same conditions.
Now, I'm curious to know, how do we see this play out in New York City? I think as a New Yorker, we're just so used to like every single type of like weather condition that is possibly out there. So how do we notice these changes in New York City?
There are a few that we're seeing really clearly. One is the potential for thunderstorms. So again, if you split the country in half, the eastern side of the country is seeing far more available energy to create thunderstorms. So the days when you've got conditions that are ripe for a thunderstorm are increasing. One of the places it's increased most is New York, and that's just over the last 40 years. Another area that you're seeing these changes in New York is coastal flooding. So not just flooding from rain, but flooding because you've got higher sea levels. And whenever we do get a nor'easter, a hurricane, or even just regular high tides, you're seeing areas all around us that are flooding far more frequently than they used to.
Now, what are we doing as a society that contributes to the issues of climate change?
We're polluting, right? That's the quickest explanation. We're releasing fossil fuels. We're burning coal and oil and gas for electricity. We're releasing methane through gas exploration, through landfills. We're releasing nitrous oxide through farming. And all of these, what we call greenhouse gases, are wrapping around the planet like a blanket on a hot day, trapping heat. And the more we add to that blanket, the hotter the surface of our planet is getting. And that's effectively the reason that we're seeing climate change. And until we stop thickening that blanket, the temperature will rise.
Now, I'm curious to know, I don't think it's an issue of like who to blame, but, is it just the average, American who is contributing to this, or is this from larger companies?
Everybody can make a difference, but just as you say, the biggest differences, the biggest opportunities are at the highest levels. So corporations, industries, governments, those levels are where we've got the opportunity to make a difference fast.
Now, I want to add, this just came to my mind, like we have made, there have been some changes. For example, in New York City, now you have to, have reusable bags. And there have been like smaller things like just trying to encourage more people to get energy saving appliances. Do you think those things help? And if they do, are they a big enough help?
They absolutely help. Unquestionably, it helps. There is a tremendous amount of work to be done to reduce the emissions that are causing this blanket of greenhouse gases. And all of these are contributing to a solution that is in sight. So yes, what you're doing as an individual, it's absolutely making a difference. We've got an awful long way to go.
Now, speaking about how long we have to go, I've heard some stories that maybe that it sounds scary, but that it's too late to, maybe reverse some things. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, just like what it looks like from here on out?
There are impacts that are baked in. There are things that we can't correct, but it is never, ever too late to make a difference. The longer we delay the solution, the more people will suffer, the more expense that will incur. But at no point is there a point of no return where it doesn't matter anymore. It will always, every step we take to reduce emissions will always have an impact on the future.
So what can we do now, I guess, on a smaller scale, like maybe one individual, and what can be done on a larger scale as a group effort?
They're connected. And so you as an individual, the choices you make, as I said, do make a difference. So when you change your diet, when you reduce what goes into the landfill, when you reduce your reliance on fossil fuels, that makes a difference. The way as an individual you can really amplify your role is to talk about climate change, talk about it with your neighbors, with your friends, but also signal to the people you do business with, to the corporations, to the industries, to policymakers, to your government. Let them know that it is important to you to fight climate change. As I said, these are where the opportunities to have big impacts lie. And the best thing we can do is make sure that the people who need to hear from us know that it's a priority. The worst thing you can do is stay silent and wait for somebody else to save the world.
Now, you mentioned diet, which I thought was pretty interesting. Can you just elaborate on that?
Diet is one of the ways that you as an individual can make a difference, partly by doing things like reducing the amount of meat you eat, particularly beef. And these are personal choices. You as an individual aren't wrecking the world's future by eating a burger, but if you can reduce things like meat from your diet, if you can eat more locally, it absolutely does reduce your carbon footprint and plays a role.
Wow. Now, what is the Climate Matter program?
Climate Matters is a program that was created for journalists and meteorologists to help them talk about the connections between climate and weather, not just broadly, but in their local markets, in their local areas. So Climate Matters allows you as a meteorologist, for example, to see what those connections are with analysis, with graphics, with experts and data in any city in the United States. So for 250 or something cities, we can tell you on a weekly basis what the trends are locally, what the climate is doing to your weather, and we also talk about impacts outside of weather. So things like farming and gardening and pests, mosquito season. So we essentially help media tell the public about what climate change looks like in their backyards.
Now, what inspired the creation of the program?
Particularly meteorologists have a powerful role as communicators. For something like almost 100 million Americans, the only scientist that you encounter on a regular basis is likely to be a meteorologist. And so because people trust scientists, they've got an opportunity to give people truthful science-based messages that they can believe and test for themselves. And by arming them with these, with these graphics and with these guides to help them communicate to audiences, we can inform people about what they can do about climate change in ways that virtually no one else could help us with.
Now, what are some ways that we can make conversations about climate change a little bit more easily digestible to those who find it difficult or maybe a little bit overwhelming? Because I know a lot of young people sometimes maybe don't watch the news, or they're scrolling on social media. How can we make these conversations a little bit more appealing to younger audiences or people who are just very unaware?
One of the ways, it can be this intimidating scientific discussion, but the truth is you're seeing it right now in your backyard. Talking about the weather and the weather connection to climate is one of the ways that you can get people to recognize and talk about it. When you've got strings of summer days that are, hotter than you ever remember, some people think that they're not remembering it right. It must have been like this growing up. The truth is, it wasn't. What you're seeing is different. When you're seeing these rainstorms that are dropping 2 and 3 inches of rain routinely, when you're seeing a coastal flood covering the part of the beach that you don't remember getting flooded before, all of these are impacts of climate change. And of course, talking about the solutions is important too. Right. These are meaningful ways that the world is actually improving. There is a lot of indication that we have reduced some of the worst prognoses of climate change, and global participation, communication, and cooperation is making a difference. So talking about things like getting your power from wind and solar instead of from coal, and reducing what goes into landfills. These are ways where your everyday behaviors and what you're seeing in the world around you connect to climate change.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us to have this discussion.
Kibin, thank you, and thank you for letting me talk about climate change.
Of course. We encourage you all to keep up with Climate Central's efforts by going to their website at www.climatecentral.org, or you can follow them on social media at Climate Central. Stay tuned, we have more open for you right after this.
Jason, let's go see your room.
What do you think? We kept it a little spare, so you can decorate it how you like.
Dinner!
Go. Excellent. Yeah, I saw you guys out there.
Dear moms and dads, what you have achieved here today is going to help us and our futures. It is why we are coming up on stage to collect your diplomas.
You know it's true.
Mom, we love you always.
Everything I do.
When you graduate, they graduate. Visit finishyourdiploma.org to find free and supportive adult education centers near you.
How do you know when you've made the right decision? It's the feeling you get in your gut. The one that tells you what's right or wrong. It's the one that says, sure, I can have a drink. Or the feeling that says, okay, I've been drinking. Now what? It's the voice inside you that says, I'm buzzed. Better leave the car when it's time to go. Plan ahead. Catch a sober ride. Buzz driving is drunk driving.
Welcome back. Following the opioid crisis, the Food and Drug Administration approved an over-the-counter version of the opioid overdose treatment drug, naloxone. Joining me to discuss this effort is Franklin Taveras Juan Cortez and Dr. Alex Bennett of NYU's School of Global Public Health Opioid Overdose Prevention Program. I want to thank you all so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Now, Doctor, can you just talk about, naloxone and Narcan and what that is?
Sure. So naloxone is a very safe and effective overdose reversal medication. Basically what happens with an overdose is someone takes too much of an opioid and their breathing slows down and the breathing eventually stops. So naloxone, essentially what it does is you can give someone naloxone intranasally, hold it back, right at the nose, and it essentially displaces the opioid receptors in the brain. The person comes back to life, starts breathing again. It's a very safe medication. It's been around, used by paramedics since the 1970s.
It takes about 2 minutes to take effect. Once you administer it, the person comes out of it. We usually tell people that you should tell them they had an overdose because what happens is they're at point A and now they're at point C. They lost B. So we always tell people, tell them you had an overdose, we gave you naloxone. Naloxone works for 90 minutes. It blocks the receptors. You can't get any more opioids in your system. They won't work. So we like to tell people to stay with them for 3 hours. If you have to leave, you tell them the rescue position. Or if you call 911 and they don't arrive and you've done the rescue position, we also recommend rescue breathing. Rescue breathing is not part of CPR. Okay. CPR is chest compressions. Rescue breathing involves putting the person on their back and giving mouth to mouth. So
naloxone has actually been around, just to add a little bit to that too. It's been around in an injectable formulation really since the 1970s, used effectively by paramedics. So as the overdose epidemic started to get worse and worse, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, more and more people were dying. So community groups actually started giving naloxone out directly to people, right? To people who use drugs especially. So again, this is a very safe, effective medication that people were able to use to save each other. The nasal naloxone actually was really approved by the FDA not until about 2015. And so this is really what primarily we about now, is the intranasal formulation.
Now, Juan, can you talk about, how naloxone was distributed prior to, it being available over the counter?
Well, initially, only paramedics had access to naloxone, and they would give like a really high dose, which would put people into immediate withdrawal, which was, it saved people's lives, but it put people in a bad space. Eventually, activists fought for the right to it be distributed to community members. So it was able to be distributed by doctors or physician's assistants. Then it evolved to the point where it was able to be distributed by outreach workers. And the saturation program took into effect where it's just distributed to all members of the community to save lives.
Now, can you also expand a little bit? I know you are also part of an organization, On Point NYC.
Correct.
Can you just expand a little bit about the work that you do to help others in regard to this?
So I believe that the distribution of naloxone is very important in saving lives. But I also believe it shouldn't be just about handing out kits. It should be about getting people connected to services. Like one of the things that we do at On Point is that we have a one-stop shopping where people could come in and receive services like mental health services. I specialize in holistic health, so I get people connected to acupuncture, to massage therapy, to Reiki. We have medical providers, we have showers, we have washing machines, and we have the first overdose prevention center in the country where people could be monitored for overdoses and be brought back. And I think that to put it all in a nutshell, is yes, getting the naloxone is out there, but people also need the love and the resources that have been affected by this opiate crisis. It's much more than just handing out a kit.
Right. I'm so glad that you mentioned that because I think sometimes when we talk about these things, it's very like A, B, C, but there, are, like you mentioned, there's a lot of things that happen in between. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Doctor, can you just talk about, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the leading cause of accidental deaths in the U.S., with 80,000 of those deaths involving opioids. Can you just talk about why, this is just such a high rate of, so many people dying from this?
Yeah, I mean, the overdose rate's been going up and up and up, almost consistently for about 20 years. In the last 2 years, it's been setting records in the number of people who have died. It's really a national, critical public health crisis. Really in the late 90s, you're seeing increasingly overdoses from prescription opioids. And then by the early 2000s, it was much more heroin, high purity heroin. What we've seen since about 2013 is more and more fentanyl, a synthetic opioid in the drug supply. Fentanyl is roughly 80 to 100 times more potent than heroin. And it's really in everywhere now. It's in a lot of the heroin, the majority of the heroin, counterfeit pills and things like that. So people don't really know what they're getting. We have an unregulated drug supply, okay? So people, it's not like going to the pharmacy and knowing you get a 5 milligram Percocet, right? You have no idea. It's Russian roulette, rolling the dice, right? So you have no idea what you're getting. So more and more people are, using potentially the same amount, and now it's a much higher dose. It's very lethal. So people are dropping like flies. Really, I would say it's the fentanyl that's going on that's really increasing. And then, and as Juan was saying in Franklin, with COVID and, really thinking about the historical impacts of structural inequality and racism and things like that, right? There's a lot of people who are sort of very disadvantaged, right? There's a lack of penetration of a lot of services in a lot of communities of color, right? There's mental health challenges, there's underemployment, right? All of these things on top of a very bad drug supply, right? So these things is like this perfect storm for overdose morbidity and mortality.
And there's a lot of stigma around drug use.
Huge stigma.
People who use substances, especially opioids, they're seen as morally defective. Something's wrong with them. Why can't they just stop? That's not our goal. Is not why can't they just stop, but keeping people alive so that maybe they have the opportunity to change their mind, change their behavior, and stop or improve their behavior, be better at doing the things that they're doing in a healthier way, lessen the risk. We also have the FTS program, the fentanyl test strip program, which is part of DOH's initiative for fentanyl. Since they recognize it to be such a dangerous substance, they are allowing outreach workers to give out fentanyl test strips in the hopes that people will test their supply before they use. People are not going to not use, but at least they'll go slow. Right. They'll call someone and tell them, hey, I'm not sure about this. They'll do an overdose prevention plan, which is what we always push people to do, which is sometimes use in public, which sounds terrible. But you know what? If you use alone, there's no one there to help you.
Right. Now, Juan, can you just talk a little bit about, he mentioned the stigma. What can be done to reduce the stigma surrounding drug overdose?
Well, I think one of the main reasons that there's such a stigma is that people that identify as people that use drugs are seen as criminals. And that in itself is a stigma, right? Also, the fact that we have to acknowledge that not everyone that is at risk for overdose has a certain look or a certain social status or even like employment status, right? Overdose doesn't have a face. Anyone could die from an overdose, and that's the message that we got to get through. And once we acknowledge that this is not a criminal problem, but it's a health issue, and that these are human beings that are not categorized or shouldn't be categorized as the drug user, but as artists, musicians, family members,
Fathers.
Loved ones, human beings. And I think that once we can get past that label, then we can make progress and reducing the death rate of overdose.
Now, Doctor, I want to know, now that this is more available, can you just talk about the responsibilities others may have to save lives? I know that recently, like in restaurants, they're making it available. What responsibility does an everyday person have in regard to just this crisis that we're experiencing?
Okay, so I guess a few things. One, is that now that naloxone, and again, just the nasal formulation is over the counter. The intramuscular is not over the counter yet, right? And it's a much cheaper formulation than the intramuscular, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Not everyone can afford the intranasal. Our program gives it out for free, and that's what we really need to do is we need to keep these low threshold, free, no cost, low cost naloxone programs going. We need them out there. I think what's happening is that with the over the counter, we're going a long way towards helping to normalize naloxone as a medication that we should have in every medicine cabinet, backpack, park, everywhere. Okay, it's just normalize it, make it very normal, and that helps to sort of saturate communities, right? So it should be everywhere. It should be everywhere. When someone is having an overdose, it should be available with a bystander.
I know that you said that there were two. Can you just explain which one is going to be over the counter?
Yeah,
and
which one is when we started. So basically what's happened is, again, the injectable formulation, which started in the 1970s, was being used and distributed by community groups throughout the 2000s. Much cheaper, right? Remedy Alliance for the People is giving it out for about $2, $3. New York City Department of Health has an incredibly good infrastructure, and they are really great public health. They give out naloxone for free. Over-the-counter injectable did not get over-the-counter status. Okay, the nasal did, and that I think has to do a little bit with the stigma associated with injecting and people who inject drugs. Right, again, reinforcing that stigma. Right, so again, people can still access the intramuscular, but over-the-counter will be intranasal. Intranasal, again, it's just very simple, right up the nose. But we don't quite know all the costs and things like that. But roughly $70. And so that can be a barrier, right? That can be a barrier. And we don't want people sort of doing a cost-benefit analysis. Should I get it? Should I not? We want them just to have it all the time for free.
And we created the Department of Health created the NCAP program, which was the Naloxone Co-Payment Assistance Program. This was done back in 2016, I think. And it was to collect all the pharmacies in New York State and let them be part of that program so that they were not just giving out naloxone, but also educated, or the pharmacists were educating people also that were getting it. That program still exists. I'm not sure in what form, because now that it's over the counter, it might change because it was part of the insurance. But it's hard for someone who doesn't have skin in the game, kind of, to say, I'm going to spend $50 for something that I might never use.
Right.
So the idea is to keep the free naloxone, to keep us working, keep us going out into the community. But then there's that individual who may be like a grandfather or a grandmother and says, you know what, my nephew is having problems with opioids. Let me buy this, goes to the pharmacy and gets it because they don't have the resources and they don't know about the syringe exchange programs. They don't know about On Point, but they do know about the pharmacy. So
can you just talk a little bit more, expand on like just the resources?
The resources?
Yeah, just resources available.
So when we engage people in the street, we have conversations with people, right? We initially talk to them about the risk factors of overdose, getting them trained in the kit, handling the kit, but also talking about what their needs. And that usually comes out like naturally for people. It's like, yeah, I'm glad I have this kit, but I'm hungry now. So the outreach workers, we're all equipped with the resource guide, and we directly either we escort people to the location or we guide people to the locations, different harm reduction agencies, whether it's they're trying to manage their drug use or they just want something to eat. They want to access some type of support groups. And it's just about talking to people and getting them connected to those services. And like I said, and if we are in that position where we have to escort someone and take them there and introduce them to people, then that's what we do.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to talk to us about this.
Thank you for having us.
We've come to the end of our show today. I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us and you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you miss any part of today's show, you can catch the Recable cast at 5 and 10 p.m. on Optimum Channel 67 and Verizon Fios Channel 33, or watch anytime on the web at bronxnet.org. I'm Kibin Alleyne, wishing you and your safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.